The title of this message is Baal and Unleavened Bread. We're going to set up a comparison between Baal, that's, it means Lord and pagan God, and evil, and unleavened bread and righteousness, because unleavened bread is righteousness. So we're going to set up that parallel. Baal, B-A-L, B-A-A-L, Baal. And there are varieties of Baals and Molochs, but they all fit in the same party. I want to tell you the story of Elijah's confrontation with paganism. It's a very dramatic event. It's in 1 Kings 18 and also in Chronicles. Elijah strolls into the palace and tells King Ahab, because of the evil of this nation, and you're slipping in the horrible paganism, much worse than ever, because of the evils and injustices, there'll be no rain or even dew until I say so. When the King Ahab think, who is this crackpot? He was a big, hairy guy. That's the way he's described in the Bible. Big, hairy, tough-looking guy, blunt, very blunt. And he walks out, and the king laughs. What kind of crackpot is he? And the king laughs. God tells him to immediately go hide himself to a cave in a creek like 20-some miles away from the city, and he does that. Well, of course, they thought it was funny. First couple of weeks, no rain and no dew even in the morning. After a month or two, it stopped being funny. The king sent everybody out, search for this guy. I'm going to bring him back here and get him to take this famine curse. I mean, not famine, but drought curse off of us. Droughts and famines kind of go together. But needless to say, they didn't find him. God's hiding him, and birds are feeding him meat and bread, and it's all in there on the creek. And the land gets sickly gray. And all the wells, as they go deeper and deeper to get water in the wells, they're starting to dry out. And the creeks and the rivers are getting lower and lower. It's hard to get water. And they're getting more desperate. And they're sending more people out searching for him. Well, he doesn't want to, his water is getting low in the creek he's at. He doesn't want to go to the Jordan River because he'll be spotted there. So God tells him to go to Zarephath. And that's a nation that borders Israel. Oddly enough, it's the nation where Jezebel is from. And one of the reasons they're getting more and more pagans because of Jezebel. And it's kind of ironic. That's where God sends him to a widow there. And he walks at night so nobody sees him. And somehow God feeds him with the birds. He sees this rather sickly-looking woman with a bunch of branches, and he asked her for some water. She said, I don't have much, but I'll share a little bit of what I got. And then he said, well, could you make me a biscuit to eat? And she says, you won't believe this. These sticks, I'm setting these to burn a fire under our oven. I've only got a little meal left and a little oil. I want to make one more biscuit for me and my son, our last meal, and then we're going to starve to death. This fast is also the area surrounding Israel are in the fast. I mean, not the fast, in the drought. The famine comes with the drought, but it's the drought is the big problem. And he says to her, looks at her sternly, he says, look, I represent the great God of heaven and the sky and of Israel. If you give me a biscuit to eat, I guarantee your bowl of flour and your jar of oil will not run out until the drought is over. And she looks at him, and for some reason she has faith. Plus, what has she got to lose? What if he is telling the truth? And sure enough, she makes him a biscuit, and then she says, my eyes must be deceiving me. There's actually more flour in the bowl and more oil in the jar. He says, and God will keep things going that way until this famine is over. And then a little while goes by, and then her son gets sick and he dies. And of course, she says to him, has God sent you to curse me because of my sin? And that's why you're really here? Of course, he feels real bad, and he takes the son up to his little room and warms up the boy, and then he prays with fervent prayer, and God brings the boy back to life. Actually, there are only a few examples of that in the Bible. Only a few people did it. Elijah, then his assistant, Elisha. Christ does it twice. Paul does it. But it's very rare in the Bible to bring somebody back from the dead. And the reason God let it happen, after that, she said, now I know that you're a special prophet from God. And she works real hard to hide his identity and take care of him because she knows, because he brought her son back to life, that he's a real prophet of God. And then God tells him, after over 3 years, it's time to go back to Samaria and tell, I call them the northern 10, or the tribes of Israel under Ahab, the northern 10 tribes, and confront them about this famine. So he goes back to Israel. And oddly enough, through Obadiah, the assistant to the king has to come to him. He doesn't go to the king. It's a matter of, like, you see all these leaders coming to Trump. It's a matter of showing who's got the power. It's just a diplomat. The king doesn't like it, but the king is desperate. So he rides up to his horse and he meets Elijah and says, it is you, isn't it? The guy that's giving Israel all this trouble. And of course, Elijah responds back, I'm not the one giving Israel all this trouble. It's you and Jezebel. You led us into paganism and evil and injustice. And the king said, well, let's don't quiver over these details. You got to lift this drought. He says, well, I'm not your servant. I'm God's servant. He said, okay, what are your conditions? What do you want? Money, bribery? And he tells him his conditions. I want the leaders of Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel and bring all the pagan priests of Baal with you. Of course, the king has no choice. He wants this drought lifted. Needless to say, they've asked the pagan priests many, many times, and they scream, but they can't do anything. You know, God controls that. By now, he realizes he probably would have put Elijah to death, but he realized this is the only guy that can call off this famine, and this nation is going to be gone soon if we don't do anything about it. So they get to Mount Carmel, and Elijah puts a challenge in front of the leaders of Israel. And I'm going to read 1 Kings 18:20. This is 1 Kings 18:20. So Ahab sent all the children of Israel to gather the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Verse 21, Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long do you waver between two sides? You're going to mean, what does he mean by waver? What he's saying to the leaders of Israel, he's saying, some of you sort of kind of worship the God that brought us out of Egypt. And the English version of his name is Jehovah. I know people argue about what it sounds like in Hebrew, but that's the English version, Jehovah. And a lot of you, because Baal just means Lord, and it's the name. Some of you think God is Baal. And you're kind of bouncing, you kind of have a compromise. You're kind of sort of with some of the stuff of God, but more and more the stuff of Baal lately. You need to decide, is Baal the real God or is Jehovah the real God? Can't be both. How long will you waver between two sides? If Jehovah or Yahweh, that's another way people think his name might have sounded in Hebrew, is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people didn't answer anything. They didn't answer. They had compromised worship. And the people were messing around with, see, a lot of people look at paganism and they think, well, paganism, it's just a few pagan idols of different kinds. And, the Asherah idols, they often had a woman with a big Coke bottle figure, and all the concerts had that one female idol. And there are all kinds of pagan idols, and you've probably seen a lot of them in little things, carvings that they have dug up and on pictures of ancient history books. People think, well, what's so bad about paganism and Baal worship? It's just, who cares? God is just too jealous. But here's what most of us don't know. And to some extent, the Bible, being a family book, doesn't really get you into the nitty-gritty. Like, for instance, in 2 Kings 16:3, talks about God's complaint was they were putting their children walking their children through the fire. You're thinking, well, maybe they're just dancing over hot coals. When it says putting their children to fire to Baal and Moloch, here's what they actually did. They had this big statue. Often it had a human body and a bull's head, but there are other versions of it. There's even one in Egypt that has a lion's body and the Pharaoh's head. You've probably seen that one. It's a big famous one, huge size. And they have variations of it. And they would light a fire underneath it. It's hollow metal. Get it burning real hot, maybe the open arms of Moloch or Baal. Moloch's just another, they have different names for Baal, different groups. And they'd have people beating drums real loud, and they would throw often little kids or babies into the fire. And the drums noise would drown out the screaming of the child. And you're going to say, but that's crazy. I know it's crazy. By the way, in case you think that's crazy, you can, I know this because I know a guy who did it. You can take a vacation to Mexico, and they'll take you to one of the Aztec centers, and you climb this little thing, and they actually show you where they threw in the human sacrifices. And they're kind of proud of it. They have numbers like they did. The Aztecs were brutal. Anyway, you probably heard some of that too. So in other words, all throughout the pagan world, this kind of thing was done. And what Baal represented was, Baal is the sun god. So when they had a good crop, sunlight, they thank Baal for the good crop. Baal is also the storm god. In other words, Baal gets angry and he unleashes nature. By the way, in those days, people didn't have, freezers and all the reserve stuff we have today. If you didn't get a good crop, you starved to death. Or if your enemy took your stuff, we could elaborate, you get the idea. They were much closer to the dangers of this dangerous world than we are. And so when something went wrong, they said, we got to appease Baal. And some other groups had different names for pagan gods, but the principle is the same. And they thought the best way to appease him was to sacrifice often their firstborn child or baby. They actually find ancient buildings in the cornerstones, they dig them up. They see all these little skulls, little babies were sacrificed. But even in some ways, even worse than that, some of the people would sell often their daughters when they were 9, 10, 11, 12, and sometimes sons, to become temple prostitutes. And that's referenced in Corinthians about. And you're going to say, we always thought that these were adult women who chose to be temple prostitutes because maybe they get a good life, they make money being a temple prostitute, but history shows that they were like enslaved to the temple, and people gave money to the pagan temple, and they get to sleep with one of the temple prostitutes. It was a religious thing. And they had all kind of wild religious orgies. Paganism. So when you hear God complain about Baal and paganism, it's not as innocent as it sounds. And there's one more thing about paganism. And I was listening to one of these historians about ancient history. The difference between the God of Israel and pagan gods did not have anything like the Ten Commandments or laws or regulations. They just didn't have that. It was just music, drink, orgies, fun, and sometimes fear, because that would give the pagan priest more power. You better give us these offerings or whatever, or else Baal will turn nature against you. But can you see because people will get mad at God. Well, do you know that there was a death penalty on false prophets in Israel? You can read about it in Deuteronomy 12 and 13. People say, well, that's evil, angry of God to do that. I understand why God did it. Because if the leadership of that country went from the true God to pagan gods, the people would be led away from good behavior, high morals, and it would undermine them in many, many ways. So God, actually, this is another way to view it. I think the Ten Commandments are for us. Remember when Christ said about the Sabbath, the Sabbath was made for man, not for God. Even the laws about idolatry were made for man and not for God. I know when you read it, it doesn't sound that way because God gets mad, but it's actually bad for a nation. It's bad for individuals when you're following witchcraft and all that other pagan garbage and the evil occult and all that goes with it. I know all that's popular nowadays, but it's not good. So Elijah said, let's test. And there have been 2 sets of bulls were set up. One for the priest of Baal, there are about 450 of them, and one with Elijah. And Elijah said, well, why don't the Baal people go first? And so they had their big ox cut up and big pile of wood, and they danced and ran around and danced and shouted and screamed, and, Baal, please, Baal, bring some fire. And of course, nobody's looking. They had a little flintstone. They tried to spark a flame, but God wouldn't let anything catch. Nothing happened for hours, and they were croaking and croaking. They got tired. And Elijah said, well, now let's fix up this old altar for God with just 12 stones represent the 12 tribes, even though there are only 10 tribes who were in northern Israel. But he set up with his bull. So the priest of Baal said, wait a minute, we got one more trick. We're going to cut ourselves and bleed, really get Baal's attention. Blood splattering. And Elijah made fun of them. And you got to get the sarcasm. He says, well, maybe Baal is on vacation. He can't hear you. Yell louder. And their voices are already hoarse from hours of screaming and hollering and jumping and blood splattering, and it caked all over him. And he laughed a bit. Well, maybe, is it possible Baal's in the bathroom and he can't be bothered? And he says a few other laughable things at Baal, and some of the people start laughing at Baal. But some pagan stuff is laughable. This little statue, actually it was a big bull. Anyway, these statues are not going to save you. And then he makes a short prayer to God. Show the people who is the true God. And people looked up and they saw this fireball coming out of the sky. And suddenly it came down and just burned up everything, left a crater, burned up the water he had soaked the wood in, burned up the bull and the wood. And the people yelled, Jehovah is God. Jehovah is God. And the people started getting mad at the false prophets. And Elijah said, don't let one of them get away. Execute them, because that's what they do. And paganism appeals to the ungodly side of human nature. One of the things in the Bible that's most amazing, people just seem to have a natural attraction to paganism. You think it's like a magnet. They get a good leader in Israel, and for 40 years they do the right thing. And when they had really good times and no pressure on them, they'd slide back into more paganism. And I'm going to read Exodus 32:22. This is when they made the golden calf, because they said, well, Moses has been on the mountain too long. We don't know what happened to him, and we want a God that we can see. And so Exodus 32:22, when Moses got back, he wasn't happy with Aaron left in charge here, and said, let not the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people that they're set on mischief. But they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. For this Moses, the man that brought us up out of Egypt, we do not know what became of him. So I threw some things into the fire, and out popped this calf. By the way, people like Ron Dart, he goes through a lot of name derivations. He doesn't think it was a calf, because this calf, who worshipped a puny little calf? It was a young bull, with horns. And by the way, pagans like bulls. And there are a lot of bulls in paganism, because actually, muscular-wise, bull is one of the most muscular animals out there. A big, strong bull. So it was really a young bull with those horns. And I'm going to read verse 25, but this is the most important verse, verse 25. And when Moses saw the people were naked, Now, some translations don't say that. They have what I call euphemistic words that mean the same thing. This is the Bible in basic English, I think, word naked. They were having a pagan orgy. And they have records of having pagan orgies in places like Carthage, where they did all kind of wife swapping and drinking and music and dancing and wild sexual orgies. You think, wow, I can see why that paganism would appeal to people, right? I'm not saying that's good for you, don't get me wrong, but you can see the appeal it would have to human nature. You know, music, drinking, irresponsible sex, and many of them also had male prostitutes for those who, anyway, we'll get into that, but that he had made them naked to their shame. So this sun god, storm god is really bad for people. 1 Corinthians 5, 6-8. Now I want to make the parallel between paganism and evil and unleavened bread and righteousness. I'll go to 1 Corinthians 5, 6-8. If anybody ever asks you, why are you New Testament Christians keeping unleavened bread? Well, it's because the New Testament church kept it. Many miles away from Jerusalem, by the way, a whole continent away in Europe. 1 Corinthians 5, 6. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens a whole lump? Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump. Notice, since you truly are unleavened. In other words, what he's saying is, I know you've thrown out your leavened bread. And if anyone hasn't yet, just when you get home, do it. For indeed, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. Now, what feast is he talking about? Unleavened bread, of course. You're going to move into the orbit of the true God when you keep unleavened bread. Let us keep the feast, because unleavened bread is more spiritual. And I'll read the rest. Keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So leaven represents sin. Paganism represents sin. Unleavened bread represents sincerity and truth. And that's what it represents. Now I want to tell a corny story just because I like to tell corny stories. 3 little pigs go out to dinner one night. The waiter comes over, says, what do you want to order for a drink? One orders Sprite, the other Coke, and the third one says, I want water, 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 and more water. Then he comes over for their entree. Okay, what would you like? And one says steak, another one says, I want a chicken salad plate. The third one says, I want water, 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 and more water. Then he comes over to ask, what do you want for dessert? And 2 of them like banana splits, and one says, I want water, water, and more water. So the waiter says, wait a minute. You're here at a restaurant, and all you're ordering is water? Why are you doing that? And the third little piggy says, well, somebody has to go wee, all the way home. See? The third pig has to play his role. He says, the role of the 3 little piggies. Well, I think some people, when it comes to paganism, they got to play their role. And they go along with the world's pagan stuff. Just for those that want to get excited about it, today there's an adult Easter egg roll in downtown Cape Girardeau. I saw it on my smartphone. So you thought that was just for kids, didn't you? And you thought Halloween parties were just for kids. They're now making more money off adults. And anyway, by the way, Easter eggs have nothing to do with Jesus Christ. They may taste good. I like the chocolate with marshmallows inside. Anyway. But leaven puffs up. It's vanity. It's when you're inflated with pride and sin, hypocrisy, that's leaven. God says, purge out the leaven and sin and evil. Remember that Jesus cleaned us. So stay humble like flat, unleavened bread. And the bull, it kind of represents, paganism. Unleavened bread, when you get unleavened, you're resisting the world. And this is a world that has a lot of paganism and or pagan compromises. I would not be so surprised that when the false prophet and the beast get here in whatever number of years, the Western world is becoming less and less Christian, at least the prosperous parts of it. They may come with some twisted religion that is in some ways like paganism, and they'll worship a man. By the way, in the pagan world, many of the leaders wanted to be worshipped. Did you know that Pharaoh was worshipped as a god? I know you're laughing at that, but I'm not making that up. And so I don't think Julius Caesar wanted to be worshipped as a god, but it kind of worked out that way. And when his nephew took over Antiochus, they made Caesar worship became a thing. We might laugh at, Hail Caesar. Actually, they're going to worship the final dictator. In other words, some pagan religious stuff is coming back to this world. The more unleavened we are, the more we're with the Bible, the more we can resist human nature. By the way, human nature is not good. I hear people saying, well, if we just remove those things in society that they think are bad for people, people are just naturally good. No, they're not. From little kids, we're selfish and petty. Anyway, Psalms 36:2. Now, I think when David wrote this, he's speaking about bad people in general, but it applies to people in general. For he flatters himself in his own eyes, too much to detect and hate his sin. The words of his mouth were iniquity and deceit. He has ceased to be wise and to do good. I've noticed a lot of people, when you talk to them, in spite of the fact that they just double-crossed you or whatever they did, they'll find ways to justify anything they do. They flatter themselves, and I'm always good. A certain person said that to me a number of times, and I know better, but what you're going to do is just listen to them. I always do the right thing. No, you don't, but you think that. But you want to believe that. That's human nature for you. Verse 4, he plots iniquity on his bed. He says some people go to bed and they're dreaming of how they can cheat somebody the next morning or other kinds of evils or mess with, whoever they shouldn't mess with. John 6:51. John 6:51. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man takes this bread for food, he will have life forever. And more than this, the bread which I give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. So when we eat unleavened bread today, at least symbolically, we're taking in the true bread, not pagan rituals, but the true bread. And the true bread is Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit he provides for us, and the good influence. John 6:57. As the living Father has sent me, and I have life because of the Father, even so, he who takes me for his food will have life, he means eternal life, because of me. Verse 58, this is the bread which came down from heaven. It is not like the food which your fathers had. They took of the manna and are dead. But he takes this bread for food will have life forever. In other words, the true bread is Jesus Christ and working with him. And unleavened bread is just our symbolic way of taking in Christ and all of his work. So be pure in our worship. Be less worldly. Be truly unleavened. Just a few things before we stop. Keep the days of unleavened bread. Let them remind us to be humble, flat, and repentant, and eschew evil and lies. Be honest with God about your own human nature. Be honest with ourselves, and be spiritually unleavened.